The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base as Major Sarah Chen completed her pre-flight inspection of the F-22 Raptor. Her call sign, Phoenix, had been earned through exceptional performance during advanced tactical training, where she had consistently demonstrated the kind of precision flying that made her one of the squadron's most respected pilots. At 28, Sarah had already accumulated over 2,000 hours in fighter aircraft and possessed the calm confidence that came from mastering one of the world's most advanced flying machines. "Phoenix, you ready for another day of showing off for the taxpayers?" called Captain Marcus Rivera from the adjacent aircraft, his voice carrying the good-natured competitiveness that defined their squadron's culture. His call sign, Viper, reflected both his aggressive flying style and his ability to strike with precision when tactical situations required immediate action. "Always ready to demonstrate air superiority, Viper," Sarah replied, securing the final inspection panel on her F-22. The Raptor's stealth coating gleamed in the California sunlight, its angular surfaces designed to defeat radar systems while housing the most sophisticated avionics package ever installed in a fighter aircraft. Today's mission would be routine air-to-air training over the Mojave Desert, the kind of exercise they had flown hundreds of times before. Their squadron leader, Lieutenant Colonel David Harrison, emerged from the operations building carrying the mission briefing materials that would guide their training exercise. Storm had earned his call sign during a deployment where he had successfully completed combat missions despite severe weather conditions that had grounded other aircraft. His 15 years of fighter pilot experience made him the natural leader for a squadron that prided itself on tactical excellence and professional competence. "Gentlemen and lady," Storm announced as the pilots gathered around the briefing table, "today's exercise will test intercept procedures against simulated hostile aircraft. Weather conditions are ideal with unlimited visibility and light winds. We'll be working with civilian air traffic control to maintain separation from commercial flights transiting our training area." The briefing covered standard procedures for the training mission, including communication protocols, weapon system parameters, and safety boundaries that would keep their exercise separated from the busy civilian air corridors that crossed Southern California. Nothing in the briefing suggested that this Tuesday morning would become anything other than routine training that prepared them for potential combat missions. Sarah studied the flight plan displayed on the overhead projector, noting the designated training areas and the commercial aviation routes they needed to avoid during their exercise. Her attention to detail had made her one of the squadron's most reliable pilots, someone who never missed important information that could affect mission success or flight safety. "Questions about today's mission?" Storm asked, scanning the assembled pilots for any concerns about the training exercise. "Negative, sir," replied Viper for the group, reflecting the confidence of experienced aviators who had flown similar missions many times before. The routine nature of the exercise meant they could focus on perfecting tactical techniques rather than learning new procedures. 45 minutes later, Phoenix and Viper were airborne in formation, climbing through 20,000 feet as they headed toward their designated training area over the desert. The F-22's engines provided smooth, powerful acceleration that pressed them back into their ejection seats as they transitioned from takeoff configuration to tactical flight profile. "Los Angeles Center, Phoenix Flight requesting vectors to Training Area Bravo 7, Sarah transmitted, following standard procedures for coordinating military training flights with civilian air traffic control. "Phoenix Flight, Los Angeles Center, turn left heading 090, climb and maintain flight level 350. Training Area Bravo 7 is active for your use." The controller's response reflected the routine coordination between military and civilian aviation that occurred thousands of times a day across the country. Military training exercises were carefully planned to avoid interference with commercial flights while providing realistic practice for combat scenarios. As they leveled at their assigned altitude, both pilots could see the vast expanse of the Mojave Desert stretching toward the horizon. The clear weather provided excellent visibility for their air-to-air training, with no clouds or atmospheric disturbances that might complicate their tactical exercises. "Phoenix, Viper, let's set up for the first intercept scenario." Storm's voice came through their headsets from his position as exercise controller. "Target aircraft will be approaching from the northwest at Angels 25. Sarah acknowledged the instruction and began configuring her F-22's radar and weapon systems for the simulated intercept mission. The training would test their ability to detect, track, and engage hostile aircraft using the Raptor's advanced sensor suite and beyond visual range weapons capabilities. 50 miles to the southeast, Captain Jennifer Walsh was conducting routine air patrol duties in her own F-22, call sign Hawk. Her mission involved monitoring civilian air traffic and providing security coverage for the greater Los Angeles area, a responsibility that required constant vigilance and professional competence during an era of heightened security awareness. "Hawk here, I have multiple civilian contacts on scope," Jennifer reported to the control center that coordinated military air patrols with civilian air traffic management. "All contacts appear normal and on filed flight plans." Her radar display showed the routine pattern of commercial aviation that characterized busy airspace over Southern California. Airliners climbed out of LAX, descended into San Diego, and followed established routes that connected major cities throughout the western United States. Nothing appeared unusual or requiring special attention from security patrols. Meanwhile, 200 miles to the east, United Flight 1847 was experiencing the beginning of what would become a life-threatening emergency. The Boeing 737 had departed Las Vegas bound for Minneapolis with 158 passengers and crew members aboard, following a flight path that would take them over eastern California and across the country to their destination. Captain Robert Mitchell felt a subtle vibration through the aircraft's control system as they climbed through 25,000 feet. With 18 years of commercial flying experience, he immediately recognized the sensation as potentially indicating a developing mechanical problem that required careful monitoring and possible corrective action. "Rebecca, are you feeling that vibration?" he asked First Officer Rebecca Martinez, who was conducting routine monitoring of aircraft systems during their climb to cruising altitude. "I feel it," Rebecca confirmed, beginning systematic checks of hydraulic pressure, engine parameters, and flight control systems that might be causing the irregular sensation. "Let me run through the diagnostics." In Seat 12D of the commercial flight, retired Air Force Colonel Patricia Williams was reading a technical journal about advances in aerospace engineering when she felt a distinctive vibration that indicated developing control surface problems. Her 25 years of military flying experience, including extensive test pilot training, allowed her to immediately recognize the early stages of what could become a serious control emergency. She had served as one of the Air Force's most accomplished test pilots before retiring 5 years earlier to pursue civilian aviation interests. Her call sign, Falcon, had been legendary among military aviators for the innovative emergency procedures she had developed while flying experimental aircraft that regularly experienced total system failures during flight test programs. The vibration pattern told her they were dealing with flutter in the primary control systems, potentially in the elevator or aileron systems. If the condition continued to develop, it could rapidly progress from minor annoyance to complete loss of control authority. Her training urged her to assess the situation carefully while remaining prepared to offer assistance if the flight crew requested help.
She discreetly observed other passengers to determine whether anyone else had noticed the aircraft's irregular behavior. Most travelers remained absorbed in their books, laptops, or conversations, unaware that anything might be developing into a serious problem. The businessman beside her continued working on spreadsheets, and the family across the aisle was managing 2 young children who were more interested in coloring books than aircraft performance. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom with the carefully controlled tone that commercial pilots used when addressing potentially concerning situations. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor mechanical vibration that we're currently diagnosing. As a precautionary measure, we're going to begin a gentle descent while we work through our procedures. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and remain seated." The announcement created the subtle shift in cabin atmosphere that occurred when passengers realized their flight might not be entirely routine. Conversations became quieter, electronic devices were secured, and people began paying closer attention to the aircraft's behavior and the crew's actions. Patricia Williams felt the aircraft begin its descent and estimated the rate at approximately 1,000 feet per minute, indicating the pilots were managing the situation conservatively while maintaining control authority. However, the continuing vibration suggested the underlying problem was still developing rather than resolving itself. Back in the military training area, Phoenix and Viper were completing their first intercept exercise when Los Angeles Center contacted them with an unusual request that would fundamentally change their training mission. Phoenix Flight, Los Angeles Center. We have a commercial aircraft experiencing mechanical difficulties. United 1847 is requesting assistance from military aircraft in the area for visual assessment of their flight condition. Sarah immediately recognized the significance of the request. Commercial aircraft rarely asked for military assistance unless they were facing serious problems that exceeded normal emergency procedures. The professional tone of the controller's voice indicated this was not a routine situation. Los Angeles Center. Phoenix Flight ready to provide assistance. What's the nature of their emergency? Phoenix Flight. United 1847 reports control surface vibration and possible hydraulic problems. They're requesting external visual assessment of their aircraft condition and flight control movement. Both F-22 pilots understood the implications of the request. Control surface problems could rapidly develop from manageable emergencies into catastrophic situations requiring immediate emergency landing procedures. Their role would be to provide professional assessment that could help the commercial crew make critical decisions about their aircraft's condition. Phoenix Flight proceeding to assist United 1847, Sarah transmitted, beginning to vector toward the distressed aircraft while Viper maintained formation position for coordinated assistance. Aboard United 1847, the situation was deteriorating beyond what Captain Mitchell and First Officer Martinez could handle using conventional emergency procedures. The vibration had intensified to the point where both pilots were fighting to maintain precise aircraft control, and warning lights were beginning to illuminate on their instrument panel. "We're losing hydraulic pressure in System A," Rebecca reported, watching critical gauges fall toward dangerous levels. "I recommend we declare an emergency and request priority vectors to the nearest suitable airport." Agreed, Captain Mitchell decided, recognizing that their situation was progressing beyond routine mechanical problems into territory that required immediate priority handling and emergency response preparation. Los Angeles Center, United 1847 declaring emergency for control difficulties and hydraulic system problems, requesting immediate vectors to nearest airport with full emergency services. The formal emergency declaration triggered coordinated response procedures throughout the air traffic control system and activated emergency services at airports within range of the distressed aircraft. However, Patricia Williams' assessment told her that conventional emergency procedures might not be adequate for the complex control problems they were experiencing. She made the difficult decision to identify herself to the flight crew and offer assistance based on her military test pilot experience with similar emergencies. Standing up from her seat, despite the aircraft's increasingly violent motion, she made her way toward the cockpit while flight attendants were securing the cabin for emergency procedures. "Excuse me," she said to the senior flight attendant. "I need to speak with the pilots. I'm a retired Air Force pilot with extensive experience in control system emergencies." The flight attendant's training normally prohibited passenger access to the cockpit during emergencies, but something in Patricia's calm competence and professional demeanor made her reconsider standard procedures. This wasn't a panicked passenger making unreasonable demands, but someone who clearly understood what was happening and possessed relevant expertise. "Follow me," the flight attendant decided, leading Patricia toward the cockpit, where Captain Mitchell and First Officer Martinez were fighting to maintain control of their increasingly unresponsive aircraft. "Captain, there's a passenger here who says she's a retired Air Force pilot and wants to help," the flight attendant announced, knocking on the open cockpit door. Captain Mitchell glanced back briefly, his hands still occupied with the challenging task of flying an aircraft that was becoming progressively more difficult to control. Under normal circumstances, he would have declined civilian assistance during emergency procedures, but their situation was rapidly moving beyond normal circumstances. "What's your background?" he asked Patricia without taking his attention away from the instrument panel that was showing increasingly concerning readings. "Colonel Patricia Williams, retired, call sign Falcon, 25 years active duty, test pilot qualified with extensive experience in experimental aircraft control system failures. The name Falcon immediately got Rebecca Martinez's attention, as she recognized it as belonging to one of the most legendary test pilots in Air Force history. Patricia's innovations in emergency flight procedures had been studied throughout military aviation and influenced training standards that were still being taught to current pilots. "Falcon?" Rebecca asked with barely concealed amazement. "The test pilot who developed the advanced recovery techniques we studied in flight school?" "That's me," Patricia confirmed, though she was focused on the immediate crisis rather than past recognition. "What's your assessment of the control situation?" Captain Mitchell quickly described their symptoms while Patricia studied the instrument readings and felt the aircraft's behavior through her experience with similar emergencies during her military career. Her analysis was swift and accurate. "You're dealing with control surface flutter, probably in the elevators with cascading hydraulic system failure. You've got maybe 10 minutes before total loss of control authority if this continues at the current rate." Her assessment matched exactly what both commercial pilots were experiencing, confirming their worst fears about the severity of their emergency while providing expert evaluation they desperately needed. "What do you recommend?" Captain Mitchell asked, recognizing that Patricia's expertise might represent their best chance for survival. "Reduce power to idle thrust and disconnect all automatic flight systems. We need to fly this manually using trim tabs and engine thrust for directional control. It's not in any commercial manual, but it works when everything else fails." Meanwhile, Phoenix and Viper had located United 1847 and were maneuvering into position to provide visual assessment of the commercial aircraft's condition. What they observed confirmed the severity of the emergency and the expertise being demonstrated by whoever was helping the commercial crew. "Los Angeles Center, Phoenix Flight has United 1847 in visual contact. We can see visible flutter in their control surfaces and irregular flight path indicating serious control difficulties." "Phoenix Flight, United 1847 is requesting direct communication with military aircraft to coordinate emergency assistance. They have military expertise on board providing technical guidance."
The request for direct communication indicated that someone aboard the commercial flight possessed knowledge of military procedures and needed to coordinate with the fighter escorts in ways that exceeded normal commercial aviation experience. "United 1847, this is Phoenix Flight. F-22s ready to provide assistance. What do you need?" Patricia had convinced Captain Mitchell to allow her to communicate directly with the military escorts, recognizing that her knowledge of both military and commercial procedures could facilitate coordination that might save the aircraft. "Phoenix Flight, this is United 1847. I need real-time visual assessment of our control surface movement and flight stability. We're flying manual control only due to hydraulic failure, and I need external confirmation of our flight attitude." The technical precision and military terminology of the request immediately impressed both F-22 pilots, who recognized they were dealing with someone who understood advanced aviation procedures at a very high level. "Copy, United 847. Moving into close formation for visual assessment. Can you identify your military advisor?" Patricia took a deep breath, knowing that her next transmission would expose her identity to military pilots who might recognize her call sign and its legendary status within the Air Force community. "Phoenix Flight, this is Falcon, providing emergency assistance to United 1847. The radio went silent for several long seconds as both F-22 pilots processed what they had just heard. The call sign Falcon was known throughout the Air Force as belonging to one of the most innovative and successful test pilots in military aviation history, whose techniques for handling aircraft with catastrophic system failures had become standard training throughout fighter pilot education. "Viper, did she just say Falcon?" Sarah's voice carried barely controlled amazement over their tactical frequency. "That's what I heard, Phoenix," Marcus replied, his own voice reflecting the awe that came from recognizing a legendary figure whose contributions had shaped their own training and careers. The call sign Falcon belonged to someone whose experimental aircraft techniques and emergency procedures had revolutionized military aviation safety. Her test flight reports were still required reading at the Air Force Test Pilot School, and her innovations in aircraft recovery from total system failure had saved countless lives throughout military and civilian aviation. "Phoenix Flight, this is Falcon." Patricia's voice came through their headsets again, cutting through their amazement with professional urgency. "I need immediate visual confirmation of our control surface positions. We're maintaining flight attitude through manual trim only." Sarah snapped back to the immediate situation, her training overriding her astonishment at hearing a legendary call sign from a civilian aircraft. Both F-22 pilots maneuvered into precise formation positions that would allow them to provide the detailed visual assessment Patricia needed to refine her emergency procedures. "Falcon, this is Phoenix Lead, moving into position for visual assessment." Sarah transmitted with the professional respect that Patricia's reputation demanded. As the F-22s closed to within 100 feet of the struggling commercial aircraft, both pilots could see the severity of United 1847's condition. The Boeing 737's control surfaces showed visible flutter, and its flight path required constant corrections that indicated the crew was working extraordinarily hard to maintain controlled flight. "Falcon, your port elevator is showing significant flutter, and your aircraft is maintaining attitude through continuous control inputs," Sarah reported, providing the external assessment Patricia needed to validate her emergency procedures. "Copy that, Phoenix Lead. Thank you for the confirmation." Marcus positioned his F-22 on the opposite side of the commercial aircraft, his trained eye evaluating the damage and stability of the Boeing 737. What he observed impressed him even more than hearing the legendary call sign over the radio. "Phoenix Lead, whoever is flying that aircraft knows exactly what they're doing. They're using techniques I've never seen in commercial aviation." Inside United 1847's cockpit, Patricia continued working with Captain Mitchell and First Officer Martinez to implement emergency procedures that drew on 25 years of military aviation experience and specialized knowledge of aircraft behavior under extreme conditions that exceeded commercial training. "Reduce power on the No. 2 engine by approximately 8%, she instructed Captain Mitchell. "We need asymmetric thrust to help compensate for the control surface flutter." Mitchell followed her guidance, recognizing that conventional emergency procedures weren't adequate for their current situation. The aircraft's response was immediate and positive, with the violent shaking reducing noticeably as Patricia's engine management techniques took effect. "That's working," Rebecca confirmed, monitoring instrument readings that showed improved stability. "How did you know that would help?" Patricia explained matter-of-factly. "Experience with experimental aircraft that lost conventional control authority. When standard systems fail, you use whatever's still working to maintain controlled flight." The F-22 escorts continued providing visual assessment and coordination support as Patricia guided the commercial crew through emergency procedures that represented the pinnacle of aviation expertise developed through decades of military test flying experience. "Falcon, your flight path has stabilized significantly. Whatever techniques you're implementing are working effectively." "Copy. Phoenix Lead. We're going to need vectors to an airport with long runways and specialized emergency equipment. This approach is going to require procedures not available at standard commercial facilities." Both F-22 pilots recognized that Patricia was requesting something unprecedented, directing a commercial aircraft to a military installation equipped to handle experimental aircraft emergencies that exceeded civilian airport capabilities. "Falcon, Edwards Air Force Base has the runway length and emergency equipment you need." "Phoenix Flight, requesting immediate clearance for United 1847 to Edwards Air Force Base. Patricia transmitted, using her knowledge of military procedures to coordinate assistance that commercial aviation couldn't provide. Meanwhile, Colonel James Peterson at Edwards Air Force Base Operations Center was coordinating emergency response procedures after receiving notification that a legendary test pilot was saving a commercial aircraft using techniques developed at his installation decades earlier. "This is unprecedented," he told his operations staff as they prepared specialized emergency equipment that hadn't been used for civilian aircraft in the base's history. "We're about to witness emergency procedures that were developed right here at Edwards, being used to save civilian lives." The coordination between Patricia's expertise, the F-22 escort's visual assessment, and Edwards Air Force Base's specialized emergency capabilities represented a unique combination of resources that would be needed to successfully conclude United 1847's emergency. As the damaged commercial aircraft descended toward Edwards under Patricia's expert guidance, word was spreading throughout the Air Force community that Colonel Patricia Falcon Williams was demonstrating why her call sign had become legendary among military aviators worldwide. The woman who had been quietly reading in seat 12D was about to complete one of the most remarkable emergency landings in aviation history, using expertise that had been developed through years of flying experimental aircraft under the most challenging conditions imaginable, now applied to saving the lives of 158 civilian passengers and crew members who had no idea they were being rescued by one of the most skilled pilots in military history. Part 1 concludes with United 1847 beginning its approach to Edwards Air Force Base under Falcon's expert guidance, with the F-22 escorts maintaining formation to provide continued assistance. The stage is set for the dramatic landing sequence and the unprecedented salute that would honor both Patricia's current life-saving actions and her legendary contributions to military aviation safety throughout her distinguished career.
The approach to Edwards Air Force Base required coordination that had never been attempted in the history of military and civilian aviation cooperation. Patricia's voice remained steady as she guided Captain Mitchell through procedures that drew on decades of test pilot experience handling aircraft at the edge of controlled flight. Edwards Tower, United 1847, requesting straight-in approach to runway 30 with military escort. Patricia transmitted, using the formal military radio procedures that reflected her extensive Air Force background. United 1847, Edwards Tower, you are cleared for straight-in approach runway 30. All emergency equipment is positioned and standing by. F-22 escorts are cleared to remain in formation through touchdown. The authorization for the fighter jets to escort the commercial aircraft all the way to landing was without precedent, but everyone involved understood they were dealing with circumstances that required abandoning normal procedural boundaries to save lives. Phoenix Flight maintained visual contact through final approach, Patricia requested. If we experience control difficulties during landing, I need immediate assessment of our aircraft attitude for possible recovery procedures. Sarah acknowledged the request while positioning her F-22 for optimal observation of the commercial aircraft's landing attempt. Through her canopy, she could see the Boeing 737 descending with flight characteristics that should have been impossible given its compromised control systems. "Colonel Peterson wants to speak with you after landing, ma'am. He was your operations officer during the X-47 program." Patricia felt a wave of emotion hearing that name from her past. Colonel Peterson had been one of the few senior officers who had supported her work on experimental aircraft programs when others had questioned whether women should be flying cutting-edge military technology. "Looking forward to seeing him again," she replied simply, though her focus remained entirely on the immediate challenge of landing an aircraft that conventional training said shouldn't be flyable. Inside the commercial aircraft cabin, passengers could see through their windows the distinctive shapes of F-22 Raptors maintaining perfect formation alongside their plane. The sight created a mixture of anxiety and reassurance as travelers understood their emergency was serious enough to require military escort, but also that help was immediately available. The businessman in seat 12E, who had been sitting next to Patricia when the emergency began, watched in amazement as the woman he had thought was an ordinary passenger coordinated with military fighters to save their aircraft. "She just saved all our lives," he said to the flight attendant, his voice reflecting the profound gratitude that comes from surviving what should have been a fatal situation. "She certainly did," the flight attendant agreed, having witnessed Patricia's expert guidance of the flight crew through procedures that exceeded anything in commercial aviation training. "United 1847, you are 3 miles from touchdown. Wind calm, visibility unlimited. Runway is clear for emergency landing." Patricia coached Captain Mitchell through the final approach phase with the precision that had made her legendary during her military career. Every instruction was clear, specific, and perfectly timed to help the commercial pilot execute techniques he had never learned during his training. "Maintain exactly 140 knots airspeed," she directed. "Any faster and we overshoot the runway. Any slower and we lose lift with no recovery options." The margin for error was essentially zero, requiring absolute precision from Captain Mitchell as he implemented flying techniques that represented the pinnacle of aviation expertise developed through Patricia's years of experimental aircraft testing. Marcus watched from his F-22 as the commercial aircraft descended on final approach with flight characteristics that demonstrated extraordinary pilot skill. "Phoenix lead, that's the most impressive flying I've ever witnessed," he transmitted. "She's maintaining stable approach with almost no control authority." "Agreed, Viper. We're watching history being made right now." At 500 feet above the runway, Patricia's voice remained absolutely calm as she provided final guidance to Captain Mitchell. "Hold current descent rate. We're committed to landing now." The Boeing 737 crossed the runway threshold at precisely the correct altitude and airspeed, testament to both Captain Mitchell's skill in executing unfamiliar procedures and Patricia's ability to teach complex techniques during life-threatening emergency. 100 feet, looking good," Rebecca Martinez called out from the first officer position, monitoring instruments that showed they were succeeding with an approach that aeronautical engineers would later study for years. The main landing gear contacted the Edwards runway with a solid impact that sent vibrations through the aircraft, followed immediately by the nose gear touching down as the Boeing 737 completed one of the most remarkable emergency landings in aviation history. "We're down," Captain Mitchell announced, his voice reflecting relief and amazement at what they had accomplished under Patricia's expert guidance. Emergency vehicles that had been positioned along the runway immediately converged on the aircraft as it rolled to a complete stop. Fire trucks, ambulances, and specialized rescue equipment surrounded the Boeing 737 within seconds, their crews ready to respond to any injuries or continuing mechanical problems. As Captain Mitchell shut down the engines, the passenger cabin erupted in spontaneous applause that continued for nearly 3 minutes. Travelers who had been certain they were facing death now celebrated survival that was owed entirely to the expertise of the woman many had barely noticed before the emergency began. Outside the aircraft, Colonel Peterson stood beside the emergency vehicles, watching the commercial airliner that had just completed an approach using techniques developed at Edwards decades earlier. His eyes scanned the cabin windows, searching for the pilot whose legendary call sign he had just heard for the first time in 5 years. Meanwhile, in their F-22 cockpit still airborne near the field, Sarah and Marcus were processing the significance of what they had just witnessed and participated in. The legendary Falcon had emerged from retirement to save civilian lives using expertise that represented the finest traditions of military aviation service. "Phoenix lead, this is Edwards Tower. Colonel Peterson requests that you and Viper remain airborne for one additional task." "Phoenix lead, this is Edwards Tower. Ready to copy." Sarah replied, curious about what additional requirements could follow the successful emergency landing they had just supported. Phoenix Lead, Colonel Peterson requests that Phoenix Flight render honors to Colonel Williams for her actions today and her distinguished service to military aviation. The request was unprecedented in its formality and significance. Rendering honors typically occurred during ceremonies or formal military occasions, not during active flight operations. But everyone understood that Patricia's actions deserved recognition that transcended normal procedural boundaries.
Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion as she understood what was being asked. They were being given the privilege of saluting one of the most legendary pilots in Air Force history, someone whose contributions had shaped the very training that had prepared them to fly the F-22 Raptor. Edwards Tower, Phoenix Flight copies and is honored to render salute, Sarah transmitted formally. Viper, are you ready for this? Absolutely, Phoenix, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the same emotional weight that Sarah felt. This is the honor of a lifetime. Both pilots positioned their F-22s for a coordinated flyover of the commercial aircraft that now sat surrounded by emergency vehicles on Edwards' main runway. They would execute a formation pass that military aviators reserved for the highest expressions of respect and honor. Phoenix Flight, you are cleared for honors flyover, Edwards Tower transmitted. Colonel Williams and all passengers are watching from the aircraft windows. Inside the Boeing 737, flight attendants had informed passengers that the F-22 escorts were going to perform a flyover to honor the woman who had saved their lives. Travelers pressed their faces to windows on both sides of the aircraft, eager to witness military precision flying that few civilians ever observed. Patricia stood in the cockpit doorway, watching through the windscreen as the two F-22 Raptors began their approach for the honors pass. She had been part of countless military ceremonies during her career, but she had never been the recipient of such formal recognition from active-duty pilots flying the most advanced fighters she had helped develop. The two F-22s approached in perfect formation, their sleek forms representing the pinnacle of aviation technology that Patricia's test pilot work had contributed to during her military service. As they drew closer, both Sarah and Marcus came to attention in their cockpits, a formal military posture that was difficult to maintain while flying high-performance aircraft. Colonel Williams, this is Phoenix Lead. We request permission to render honors for your distinguished service and your actions today that saved 158 lives. Patricia's response was delayed by several seconds as she processed the emotional significance of receiving formal recognition from pilots who represented the current generation of aviators benefiting from her contributions. When she spoke, her voice carried emotions she had kept controlled throughout the emergency. Permission granted, Phoenix Flight. Thank you for your assistance today. The two F-22 Raptors passed directly over the commercial aircraft at precisely 500 feet, their formation so perfect that they appeared to be connected by invisible bars. As they crossed overhead, both pilots executed formal salutes that were visible to observers on the ground and to passengers watching from the Boeing 737's windows. Colonel Williams, it has been the honor and privilege of our careers to work with you today. Your expertise exemplifies the finest traditions of military aviation service. Marcus added his own recognition over the radio. Ma'am, your techniques saved these lives and will continue saving lives for generations. Thank you for your service to our country and to aviation safety. The moment was unprecedented in both military and civilian aviation history. Two pilots flying America's most advanced fighters had rendered formal salutes to a retired officer aboard a civilian aircraft, acknowledging not only her current heroism, but also her legendary contributions to military aviation throughout her distinguished career. Inside the commercial aircraft, passengers who had witnessed the flyover and heard the radio transmissions through the cockpit speakers began applauding again, this time understanding that they had been saved by someone whose expertise was recognized at the highest levels of military aviation.
The businessman from seat 12E approached Patricia with tears in his eyes. "That salute was for you," he said with profound respect. "Who are you, really?" "Just someone who did what was necessary," Patricia replied, though everyone present understood she was far more than that simple description suggested. Colonel Peterson was the first to board the aircraft after emergency crews had completed their safety inspection. His face showed both professional respect and personal emotion as he made his way to the cockpit where Patricia was helping the commercial crew complete post-landing procedures. "Colonel Williams," he said formally, using her retired rank in recognition of her service and current actions. "Welcome back to Edwards, though I wish it were under less dramatic circumstances." "Jim," Patricia replied warmly, reverting to the first-name basis they had used during their years working together on experimental aircraft programs. "Thank you for authorizing the landing here. Commercial airports couldn't have handled the approach we needed." "When I heard Falcon on the radio requesting emergency assistance, I knew exactly what needed to be done. Your techniques were developed here at Edwards. It's fitting that they were used here to save lives." Their conversation was interrupted by Captain Mitchell, who wanted to formally thank Patricia for saving his aircraft and everyone aboard. His professional composure had returned now that the immediate crisis was concluded, but his voice still carried the strain of having flown one of the most challenging approaches of his career. "Colonel Williams, I've been flying commercially for 18 years, and I've never experienced anything like what you guided us through today. Your knowledge saved this aircraft when conventional procedures would have failed." "You executed the techniques perfectly, Captain," Patricia replied with genuine appreciation for the commercial pilot's skill. "Without your ability to implement unfamiliar procedures under extreme pressure, my knowledge wouldn't have been enough." As passengers began deplaning onto the Edwards tarmac, each person paused to thank Patricia personally. The spontaneous receiving line demonstrated the profound gratitude of people who understood they had been saved by someone whose expertise was recognized at the highest levels of military aviation. A mother holding her young daughter's hand stopped in front of Patricia with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for saving my baby," she said simply, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're very welcome," Patricia replied gently, moved by the woman's gratitude and the realization that her actions had protected families who could now continue their lives together. Major General Elizabeth Thompson, commander of Edwards Air Force Base, arrived at the scene to personally greet the legendary test pilot whose emergency landing would be studied and analyzed throughout military and civilian aviation communities. "Colonel Williams, I am General Thompson. Your actions today have brought tremendous honor to Edwards and to the entire Air Force. I'd like to discuss how we can properly recognize your service and your current heroism." Patricia's response reflected both appreciation for the recognition and concern about publicity that might disrupt the quiet retirement life she had built away from military aviation. "General, I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm not seeking recognition. I simply did what my training prepared me to do." "I understand your preferences, Colonel," General Thompson replied with respect for Patricia's position. "However, your techniques will be studied throughout aviation, and your story will inspire both military and civilian pilots for generations. Some level of recognition is inevitable given the significance of what you accomplished." Meanwhile, Sarah and Marcus had landed their F-22s and were making their way to the commercial aircraft, eager to meet in person the legendary pilot they had just honored with their flyover salute. Both felt a mixture of professional respect and personal nervousness about meeting someone whose contributions had shaped their own aviation careers. "Colonel Williams," Sarah said as she approached, coming to attention with a formal salute that acknowledged both Patricia's retired rank and her legendary status within military aviation. "I am Major Chen, call sign Phoenix. It was an honor to provide assistance today." Patricia returned the salute with the crisp precision that reflected her years of military service. "The honor was mine, Major. Your visual assessment and coordination were essential to our successful landing." Marcus added his own salute and introduction. "Captain Rivera, ma'am, call sign Viper. Your flight test reports were required reading during our F-22 training. We studied your emergency procedures extensively. Then you understand why they work, Patricia replied with a slight smile. Aircraft don't care about regulations or standard procedures. They only respond to correct application of aerodynamic principles. The conversation between Patricia and the two F-22 pilots attracted attention from passengers who were still processing the realization that they had been saved by someone whose expertise was recognized at the highest levels of military aviation. Many pulled out cell phones to photograph and record the historic meeting between the legendary test pilot and the current generation of fighter pilots who had honored her service.
News media representatives were already arriving at Edwards, having monitored emergency radio communications and recognized the historic significance of a legendary military pilot saving a civilian aircraft using techniques developed during classified test programs. The story of Falcon's emergency landing would dominate aviation news for weeks and inspired discussions about military expertise serving civilian communities. Colonel Peterson took Patricia aside for a private conversation about the implications of her public emergence from retirement and the recognition that would inevitably follow her heroic actions. "Patricia, you know this story is going to receive tremendous media attention. Your privacy is effectively over as of today." "I understand," Patricia replied, having already accepted that consequence during the emergency when she chose to identify herself and provide assistance. Saving those lives was worth any personal complications that follow. "The Air Force will want to formally recognize your actions," Colonel Peterson continued. "There will likely be ceremonies, interviews, and requests for you to participate in training programs and safety initiatives." Patricia nodded, recognizing that her expertise represented a resource that could benefit far more people than just the passengers of United 1847. Her techniques had applications throughout military and civilian aviation that could prevent future emergencies or improve outcomes when disasters occurred. "I'll do whatever helps improve aviation safety," she said decisively. "If my knowledge can save lives, then public recognition is a small price to pay." Her answer reflected the character that had made her legendary during her military career. Patricia had always prioritized mission success and the safety of others over personal comfort or recognition. Those same values would guide her decisions about participating in the post-emergency processes that would analyze her techniques and incorporate them into broader aviation training. As the sun began setting over the Mojave Desert, United 1847's passengers were being transported to comfortable accommodations where they could rest and process their survival of an emergency that could easily have ended tragically. Many would maintain contact with Patricia in the months that followed, forming relationships based on shared experience of life-threatening crisis and miraculous survival. The Boeing 737 itself became the subject of intensive investigation as aviation experts sought to understand exactly what had failed and how Patricia's unconventional techniques had maintained controlled flight despite conditions that exceeded the aircraft's design limitations. The investigation would lead to new training requirements and enhanced emergency procedures throughout commercial aviation. For Patricia, the day's events marked the end of her quiet retirement and the beginning of a new chapter where her military expertise would serve broader purposes than she had imagined when she boarded United 1847 that morning as an ordinary passenger traveling from Las Vegas to Minneapolis. The salute from the F-22 pilots had been more than ceremonial recognition. It represented the Air Force's acknowledgement that Patricia's contributions to military aviation continued having value years after her retirement, and that her knowledge deserved the highest respect from current aviators who benefited from innovation she had developed during her distinguished career. As darkness fell over the Mojave Desert, Patricia stood on the flight line watching the silhouettes of F-22 Raptors that represented aviation technology she had helped develop through decades of test pilot work.
The aircraft she had once flown had been replaced by more advanced systems, but the fundamental principles she had discovered about emergency flight procedures remained as relevant as ever. Colonel Peterson joined her on the flight line, bringing 2 cups of coffee, and the comfortable silence of old colleagues who had shared professional challenges and triumphs during their years working together on experimental aircraft programs. "You always did have a gift for making impossible flights look routine," he said, after several minutes of quiet observation. "Today wasn't about making it look routine. It was about using every bit of knowledge I've accumulated over 25 years to keep people alive." "You succeeded brilliantly," Colonel Peterson affirmed. "Those passengers and crew owe you their lives, and the aviation community owes you lessons that will benefit thousands of future flights." Patricia nodded, accepting the truth of his assessment, while already thinking about how her emergency techniques could be taught to other pilots and incorporated into training programs that would enhance aviation safety broadly. The woman who had been sitting quietly in seat 12D that morning had demonstrated why her call sign Falcon had become legendary throughout military aviation. Her expertise had saved 158 lives through knowledge developed during a distinguished career dedicated to advancing aviation safety and capabilities. The unprecedented salute from the F-22 pilots had honored both her current heroism and her lifetime of contributions to military aviation excellence. In the years that would follow, Patricia's emergency landing at Edwards Air Force Base would be studied in flight schools throughout the world as an example of expertise, courage, and dedication to service that defined the best traditions of both military and civilian aviation. The story of how 2 F-22 Raptors saluted the passenger in seat 12D would inspire generations of pilots to recognize that true excellence in aviation came not from seeking recognition, but from mastering knowledge so thoroughly that it could save lives when circumstances required extraordinary expertise and unshakable composure under pressure. Colonel Patricia Falcon Williams had proven that heroes often travel unrecognized among ordinary passengers, waiting for moments when their extraordinary capabilities could serve purposes greater than themselves.
6 months after the emergency landing at Edwards Air Force Base, Patricia Williams stood before the graduating class of the Air Force Test Pilot School, the same institution where she had earned her wings as an experimental aircraft pilot 28 years earlier. The auditorium was filled with the next generation of military aviators who would push the boundaries of flight technology and develop the emergency procedures that could save lives when everything went wrong. When I boarded United Flight 1847 that morning, I was just another passenger heading home, Patricia began, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her legendary among military pilots. I had no intention of ever flying again. No desire to relive my military career, and certainly no expectation that I would be standing here today. The students listened with rapt attention, knowing they were hearing from someone whose contributions to aviation safety had shaped the very curriculum they were studying. Patricia's emergency techniques had been incorporated into required training for every test pilot program in the world. But circumstances don't wait for our intentions or desires. That aircraft needed help that only specific knowledge and experience could provide. The question I faced wasn't whether I wanted to get involved, but whether I was willing to use what I knew to help people who needed it. Major Sarah Chen sat in the front row, having been invited to participate in the graduation ceremony as recognition for her role in supporting United 1847's emergency. Beside her sat Captain Marcus Rivera, both pilots now serving as instructors, teaching advanced tactical procedures to F-22 squadrons throughout the Air Force. Patricia's speech continued, drawing lessons from the emergency that extended beyond technical flying skills to address the broader responsibilities that came with specialized expertise and the importance of maintaining competence even after formal service had ended. Every one of you in this auditorium will develop knowledge and skills that very few people in the world possess. Test pilots see aircraft behavior that commercial pilots never encounter.
You will learn how to handle total system failures, how to maintain control when everything says the aircraft should be unflyable, and how to extract yourself from situations that would be fatal for less trained aviators. She paused, looking across the audience of young pilots whose careers were just beginning, while hers had supposedly ended years earlier. But here's what I learned that day over the Mojave Desert. Your expertise doesn't stop being valuable when you retire. The knowledge you develop during military career continues having applications throughout your lifetime. You may think your flying career will end when you leave active duty, but the truth is that your ability to serve others through your specialized knowledge never really ends. The speech resonated deeply with students who understood they were being prepared for careers that would demand extraordinary dedication and would develop capabilities that could serve society in ways that extended far beyond military missions. Colonel James Peterson, now serving as commandant of the test pilot school, watched Patricia deliver her message with personal pride and institutional satisfaction. Her presence at Edwards represented the Air Force's acknowledgement that forcing her into early retirement had been a mistake driven by prejudices that no longer had place in modern military culture. After the formal graduation ceremony concluded, Patricia found herself surrounded by young pilots eager to discuss emergency procedures and to hear first-hand accounts of the techniques that had saved United 1847. Their questions were technically sophisticated and professionally motivated, reflecting the high caliber of students selected for test pilot training. Colonel Williams, when you disconnected the hydraulic systems and went to manual trim control, how did you calculate the engine thrust differential needed to maintain directional stability? Asked Lieutenant Jennifer Morrison, a newly graduated test pilot who would be assigned to experimental unmanned aircraft programs. Patricia's answer demonstrated the depth of knowledge that came from years of experience handling aircraft at the edge of controllability. The calculations aren't mathematical in the moment. They're based on feeling the aircraft's response and making continuous adjustments. That's why we practice emergency procedures until they become instinctive rather than analytical. Her explanation revealed the difference between textbook knowledge and operational expertise developed through thousands of hours flying aircraft under extreme conditions. The students recognized they were learning from someone who had transcended technical competence to achieve the intuitive mastery that defined the very best pilots. Meanwhile, in Washington, the National Transportation Safety Board was completing its final report on United Flight 1847's emergency. The investigation had revealed mechanical failures that validated Patricia's assessment and confirmed that conventional emergency procedures would have been inadequate for the multiple system problems the aircraft had experienced. Colonel Williams' techniques represented the only viable approach for maintaining controlled flight given the cascade of failures that affected this aircraft, the report concluded. Her actions saved 158 lives and provide valuable lessons for enhancing commercial aviation safety training. The NTSB's findings had already influenced new Federal Aviation Administration requirements for enhanced emergency training that incorporated elements of Patricia's military test pilot techniques into commercial pilot education. Airlines throughout the world were implementing procedures based on her methods, ensuring that her knowledge would benefit aviation safety far beyond the single emergency she had personally managed. Colonel Robert Mitchell, the United Airlines pilot who had executed Patricia's emergency procedures during the landing, had become one of the most vocal advocates for incorporating military expertise into commercial aviation training. His testimony before congressional committees examining aviation safety had emphasized the value of knowledge that existed outside traditional civilian pilot education. Colonel Williams saved my aircraft and everyone aboard through expertise that isn't taught in commercial flight schools, he had told lawmakers. We need to find ways to capture that military knowledge and make it available to civilian pilots who may face similar emergencies. His advocacy was contributing to new partnerships between military test pilot programs and civilian aviation authorities, creating pathways for sharing knowledge that had previously remained isolated within specialized military communities. Rebecca Martinez, the first officer who had worked alongside Patricia during the emergency, had accepted a position developing enhanced training curricula for United Airlines Pilot Education Center. Her programs incorporated lessons learned from the emergency and emphasized the importance of remaining calm and adaptable when aircraft behavior exceeded standard operational parameters. The most important thing Colonel Williams taught me wasn't a specific technique. It was the mindset of treating every system failure as a solvable problem rather than an insurmountable crisis. That mental approach makes the difference between successful emergency management and panic that prevents effective action. Back at Edwards, Patricia's reunion with the F-22 pilots who had honored her with their flyover salute had developed into lasting professional relationships. Sarah and Marcus frequently consulted with Patricia about advanced tactical procedures, drawing on her experience with experimental aircraft to enhance their own understanding of flight at the edge of performance envelopes.
"Working with you during that emergency changed how I think about flying," Sarah told Patricia during a private conversation after the graduation ceremony. "I realized that all our training and technology ultimately depends on human judgment and expertise when situations exceed what systems are designed to handle." Patricia appreciated the young pilot's insight, recognizing that Sarah had grasped one of the fundamental truths about aviation that many pilots never fully understood. Aircraft are incredible machines, but they're still just machines. When everything fails, what saves lives is knowledge, experience, and the ability to remain calm while implementing procedures that have never been practiced before. Their conversation was interrupted by General Elizabeth Thompson, who had traveled from her Pentagon assignment to personally congratulate the graduating test pilot class and to discuss with Patricia the ongoing policy reforms that had been initiated following United 1847's emergency. "Colonel Williams, your story has catalyzed important conversations about how the military utilizes and retains specialized expertise," General Thompson explained. "We're implementing new policies to prevent the loss of qualified personnel due to institutional biases that have nothing to do with professional competence." The policy reforms represented institutional acknowledgement that the Air Force had made mistakes in allowing discrimination to drive away talented officers whose contributions could have continued benefiting military aviation for years beyond their forced retirements. "I appreciate the reforms, General," Patricia replied, "but the real question is whether current policies will protect the next generation of pilots who bring diverse perspectives and experiences to military aviation." "That's exactly what we're addressing," General Thompson assured her. "Your case study is being used throughout military personnel training to illustrate how institutional prejudices cost us capabilities we cannot afford to lose." The policy reforms represented institutional acknowledgement that the Air Force had made mistakes in allowing discrimination to drive away talented officers whose contributions could have continued benefiting military aviation for years beyond their forced retirements. "I appreciate the reforms, General," Patricia replied, "but the real question is whether current policies will protect the next generation of pilots who bring diverse perspectives and experiences to military aviation." "That's exactly what we're addressing," General Thompson assured her. "Your case study is being used throughout military personnel training to illustrate how institutional prejudices cost us capabilities we cannot afford to lose." The conversation reflected broader changes occurring throughout military culture as leadership recognized that diversity of backgrounds and perspectives contributed to operational effectiveness rather than detracting from it. Patricia's expertise had become a symbol of what the Air Force gained by embracing talent regardless of factors unrelated to professional competence. As evening approached, Patricia walked across the Edwards flight line where she had once conducted experimental aircraft testing that had advanced military aviation capabilities significantly. The same runways that had witnessed her groundbreaking test flights had recently been the stage for her emergency landing that demonstrated the enduring value of knowledge developed during those earlier years. Colonel Peterson joined her on the flight line, bringing the comfortable camaraderie of colleagues who had shared professional challenges and understood each other's contributions to aviation advancement. "You know,
When I heard Falcon on the radio that day, my first thought was that it couldn't possibly be you. You had been so determined to leave military aviation behind after your retirement." "I did leave it behind," Patricia replied thoughtfully, "but what I learned was that you can leave the military without leaving behind the knowledge and capabilities that military service developed. That expertise remains part of who you are, available to serve others when circumstances require it." Her insight captured an important truth about military service that extended beyond individual careers to encompass the broader ways that veterans contributed to civilian society through specialized knowledge developed during their time in uniform. "The salute from those F-22 pilots meant more to me than any formal ceremony or recognition," Patricia continued. "It represented acknowledgement from the current generation of aviators that my contributions still had value and relevance years after I stopped flying military aircraft." Colonel Peterson nodded, understanding the personal significance of that moment for someone whose military career had ended under circumstances that hadn't properly recognized her exceptional service. "Those pilots rendered honors not just for what you did that day, but for everything you contributed to military aviation throughout your career. That salute was long overdue recognition that the Air Force should have provided when you retired." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah and Marcus, who were preparing to depart Edwards for their return to their operational squadron. Both young pilots wanted to say goodbye to Patricia and to express again their gratitude for the opportunity to work with someone whose legendary status had been earned through exactly the kind of expertise they were striving to develop in their own careers. "Colonel Williams, thank you for everything you taught us. The lessons from working with you during that emergency will influence how we fly for the rest of our careers." Marcus added his own appreciation. "Ma'am, rendering that salute was the greatest honor of my military service. You represent everything we aspire to achieve as military aviators." Patricia's response reflected the humility that had characterized her approach to recognition throughout the months since the emergency. "I've made peace with being a public figure. I was my honor working with pilots who represent the finest traditions of military aviation. You executed your role perfectly, and your professionalism contributed just as much to saving that aircraft as my emergency techniques did." As the two F-22 pilots departed, Patricia reflected on how the emergency had transformed her relationship with military aviation and had created opportunities to contribute her expertise in ways she had never anticipated when she retired 5 years earlier. The months following United 1847's emergency had brought numerous requests for Patricia to participate in aviation safety conferences, training program development, and policy discussions about military personnel retention. She had accepted selected opportunities that aligned with her desire to improve aviation safety and to prevent other qualified personnel from experiencing the institutional discrimination that had ended her own military career prematurely. Her consulting work with the FAA had contributed to new training requirements that incorporated military emergency procedures into commercial pilot education. Airlines were implementing enhanced curricula based on her techniques, and aviation authorities worldwide were studying her methods for potential adoption in their own training standards. Patricia had also accepted a position on the Air Force's Personnel Review Board, where her experience provided valuable perspective on the institutional changes needed to retain talented officers and to create inclusive environments where diverse personnel could contribute their full capabilities without facing discrimination based on irrelevant personal characteristics. The work was meaningful and utilized her expertise in ways that served both military and civilian aviation communities, but it also required accepting public recognition that she had initially avoided after her forced retirement. "I've made peace with being a public figure," she told her husband Michael during one of their evening conversations about the changes the emergency had brought to their lives. "If my visibility helps improve aviation safety and prevents others from facing the discrimination I experienced, then it's worth the loss of privacy." Michael had supported her decision to engage with the opportunities that followed the emergency, recognizing that Patricia's knowledge represented resources too valuable to keep hidden simply because public attention made her uncomfortable.
"You've always been someone who puts service above personal comfort," he reminded her. "That's what made you an exceptional test pilot, and that's what makes you an exceptional advocate for aviation safety and institutional reform." As Patricia prepared to leave Edwards Air Force Base after the graduation ceremony, she took one final walk across the flight line where her military aviation career had reached its peak before institutional prejudices had forced her early retirement. The sun was setting over the Mojave Desert, casting long shadows across runways that had witnessed decades of experimental aircraft testing and aviation advancement. She thought about the young pilots who had just graduated from the test pilot school, recognizing that they would develop knowledge and capabilities that could serve society in ways extending far beyond their military careers. Her own experience had demonstrated that expertise developed during military service retained value throughout life, available to help others when circumstances required specialized knowledge and unshakable composure under pressure. The emergency that began as a routine flight from Las Vegas to Minneapolis had become a defining moment that honored the past, served the present, and would influence the future of aviation safety and military personnel policies for generations to come. Colonel Patricia Falcon had proven that legends earned their status not through seeking fame, but through consistent dedication to excellence that saved lives when expertise mattered most. The story of how two F-22 Raptors saluted the passenger in seat 12D would inspire pilots, veterans, and citizens to recognize that extraordinary capabilities often traveled unnoticed among ordinary people, waiting for moments when they could serve purposes greater than themselves.